Sienna Carter rushed into the hospital in the middle of excruciating labor, but no one could have predicted that what happened next would leave the entire medical team in absolute shock. A mysterious black dog suddenly appeared, growling and blocking the stretcher as if it was protecting a terrifying secret. As Sienna was wheeled into the delivery room, instead of screams of pain, she let out a howl like a wolf, and at that moment, something unimaginable happened. When the first baby was born, Dr. Ethan Grayson immediately fainted, Nurse Rachel staggered back in fear, and the entire hospital was consumed by sheer horror. The newborn had fur covering its face, looking like a creature that did not belong to this world. But was this a rare medical phenomenon? Or was there a mystery far beyond human understanding? Watch until the end of the story to uncover the shocking truth. Do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It was a morning like any other at St. Vincent Hospital in New York. The sterile white hallways echoed with hurried footsteps, the murmurs of doctors discussing patient cases, and the occasional beeping of heart monitors. Nurses moved swiftly between rooms, adjusting IV drips and checking charts. In the distance, an elevator chimed softly as its doors slid open. Everything was routine, predictable, controlled. Then the automatic doors of the emergency room slammed open with a loud bang, shattering the ordinary flow of the day. A woman stumbled in, clutching her stomach, her face pale and contorted in agony. She barely made it past the entrance before doubling over, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Sweat dripped down her forehead in thick beads, and with each strained step, a small trail of amniotic fluid trickled down her legs, pooling on the shiny floor beneath her. "I need help. My baby is coming." Her voice, hoarse and strained, echoed through the lobby, cutting through the usual hum of the hospital like a thunderclap. All eyes turned to her. Patients waiting in chairs froze mid-conversation. A receptionist gasped and reached for the emergency button. A janitor, gripping his mop, stood motionless, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Dr. Ethan Grayson had just stepped through the main hallway, still in his street clothes, a backpack slung over his shoulder. He had barely arrived for his shift when he heard the desperate plea. He turned, his trained eyes locking onto the chaotic scene. In his years of medical experience, he had seen plenty of high-risk deliveries, but something about this one felt different. There was a raw intensity in the woman's face, something beyond pain, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A stretcher now. His voice was sharp, cutting through the momentary paralysis that had gripped the room. Nurse Rachel, one of the fastest and most efficient nurses on staff, snapped into action, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor as she sprinted toward the supply area. Within seconds, she returned, pushing a stretcher with quick, practiced movements. Dr. Ethan rushed forward, reaching the woman just as her legs wobbled dangerously beneath her. She was going to collapse. He caught her, steadying her with firm hands. Her body trembled violently, her fingers digging into her belly, as though something inside her was resisting the birth itself. "We have to move fast. She's going to give birth right here if we do not get her to the delivery room now." Rachel nodded, positioning the stretcher. Together, they carefully lifted the woman onto it. But the moment her back touched the surface, she let out a guttural groan, her entire body arching with a force that startled even the experienced medical team. Her hands clutched at her stomach with such intensity that her knuckles turned white. Her moans were not just from pain. There was something else woven into them, a trembling, guttural sound that did not quite belong in the realm of human suffering. Dr. Ethan exchanged a glance with Rachel, a silent acknowledgement that something was very wrong. They began pushing the stretcher down the hall, their footsteps echoing in a hurried rhythm. The woman's breathing was erratic, her face twisting in an expression of agony and something deeper, something closer to fear. Then, without warning, the stretcher jerked to a sudden stop. Dr. Ethan nearly lost his grip. He looked down, expecting to see a wheel jammed or a mechanical malfunction. But what he saw instead sent a cold wave of shock through him. A large black dog stood at the base of the stretcher, its powerful jaws clamped tightly onto the metal frame. It was not just any dog. It was massive, its sleek coat gleaming under the hospital's fluorescent lights. Its muscles were taut with tension, and its teeth were locked around the stretcher with a force that seemed almost unbreakable. The growl that rumbled from its throat was deep, almost unnatural, vibrating through the air like a distant storm rolling over the horizon. Dr. Ethan took a step back, instinctively putting himself between the animal and the woman on the stretcher. His pulse pounded in his ears. "Hey, buddy, you have to move. We need to get through." He reached out carefully, attempting to nudge the dog aside. But the moment his fingers brushed against its fur, the growl deepened, reverberating through the hallway like a warning. Rachel, normally composed in high-pressure situations, hesitated for the first time. She knelt down slightly, trying a softer approach. "Come on, move out of the way." The dog did not move. It stood its ground like an immovable statue, its stance rigid, eyes glowing with an intelligence that sent a shiver through the air. By now, the hospital had come to a near standstill. Staff members paused mid-task. Patients peeked through half-open doors. A tense silence fell over the space, broken only by the dog's growls and the woman's faint, pained moans. "Where did this dog come from?" whispered a janitor, his broom frozen in midair. "Who let an animal in here?" asked a security guard, appearing at the edge of the hallway, his expression a mix of disbelief and irritation. Dr. Ethan and Rachel exchanged glances. Neither had an answer, but time was slipping away. Then something even stranger happened. The woman on the stretcher, whose face had been twisted in agony, suddenly tilted her head back. Her lips parted, but instead of another scream, a sound unlike anything heard in a hospital before escaped her throat. It was not a moan. It was not a scream. It was a howl. Long, deep, unmistakable. A sound that sent chills running through every person in the hallway. The dog's ears perked up instantly. It released the stretcher abruptly, standing at full attention. Then it barked. Once. Twice. A sound that bounced off the pristine white walls, making even the most seasoned hospital workers flinch. This cannot be happening. The woman's voice was faint, nearly lost amid the contractions racking her body. Her gaze, glassy with pain, turned toward the dog. "We will be okay. Do not worry." The animal stared at her for a long moment, its golden eyes shining with an unsettling awareness, as if it understood every word. Then, without another sound, it took 2 slow steps back, but it did not leave. It stood there, motionless, watching, guarding. Dr. Ethan shook his head, trying to push aside the unease twisting in his chest. There was no time for this. He grabbed the stretcher, gripping it tighter than necessary, and looked at Rachel. "Now we move." Together, they pushed the stretcher forward with renewed force, their feet pounding against the tile as they raced toward the delivery room. Dr. Ethan's mind was spinning with questions he had no time to answer. Who was this dog? Why was it here? But none of that mattered now, because something much bigger was about to happen. As the wheels of the stretcher rolled swiftly toward the delivery room, the tension in the hospital grew thicker. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, as if the very air was charged with something unseen. The black dog still stood motionless in the hallway, its golden eyes locked onto the woman being wheeled away. The eerie silence was broken only by the hurried footsteps of Dr. Ethan Grayson and Nurse Rachel as they pushed forward, their breaths shallow and controlled. Inside the delivery room, the chaos began. The medical team, already prepped for an emergency delivery, snapped into action. The crisp snap of latex gloves echoed through the sterile space as Dr. Ethan pulled on his surgical gloves. Rachel adjusted the monitoring equipment, ensuring the baby's heart rate was stable. The woman on the stretcher, Sienna Carter, writhed in pain, her face glistening with sweat. "How many months along are you, doctor?" Ethan asked, his voice even but tinged with urgency. 9 months, she gasped between contractions. "I think it is twins." Dr. Ethan's brow furrowed. A twin birth without any prior ultrasounds or medical records was risky. "Have you had an ultrasound?" Sienna shook her head slowly, her breath shallow. "No, I wanted it to be a surprise." A heavy silence hung in the air for a brief moment. Surprises were rarely a good thing in a delivery room. Dr. Ethan exchanged a glance with Rachel, both of them silently processing the added risk. "We need to move quickly. The contractions are too strong. She is fully dilated. We do not have time for further scans." Rachel positioned herself by Sienna's side, squeezing her hand gently. You are doing great, Sienna. When I tell you to push, give it everything you have. Sienna let out a strangled moan, her body trembling. Dr. Ethan focused, his hands steady as he prepared for the delivery. Push, Rachel instructed. Sienna bore down, her face twisted in agony. The monitors beeped in rapid succession as the contractions reached their peak. The air was thick with tension, the room filled with the raw intensity of childbirth. Dr. Ethan's eyes widened as he saw the baby begin to emerge. But something was off. There was a delay. The baby was not sliding out as expected. The positioning was unusual. This is not normal, he muttered under his breath. Rachel glanced over, her expression tightening. What is wrong? I do not know yet. Dr. Ethan adjusted his position, carefully maneuvering his hands. The baby was coming, but its movements were not what he anticipated. Then it happened. Sienna let out a primal cry, her body arching off the bed. At that exact moment, from somewhere deep within the hospital halls, the sound of a long, piercing howl echoed through the building. The medical staff froze. Rachel's grip on Sienna's hand tightened instinctively. Did you hear that, doctor? Ethan ignored the shivers that crawled up his spine and focused. There was no time to be distracted. One final push is Sienna, he instructed, his voice firm. With every ounce of strength left in her, Sienna pushed. The baby emerged, slick and crying, its tiny hands clenching the air. For a moment, there was relief, a brief sense of normalcy. The room exhaled collectively. Perfect, healthy, completely normal. Dr. Ethan took a steadying breath. The contrast between the two infants was staggering. One bore an unusual, almost primal feature. The other was an ordinary, healthy newborn. Sienna, exhausted but conscious, turned her head weakly toward Rachel. Are they okay? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel hesitated. She glanced at Doctor Ethan, searching for guidance. They are both stable, Doctor, Ethan finally said, carefully choosing his words. We need to run some tests to understand more, but they are here, and they are breathing. A weak smile formed on Sienna's lips before her eyes fluttered closed, slipping into exhaustion. Dr. Ethan took a deep breath, his mind spinning. He turned to Rachel. Get the neonatal team in here. We need a full examination. Rachel nodded and hurried out of the room. Dr. Ethan looked down at the baby boy in his hands. His tiny fingers curled slightly, his dark lashes resting against his cheeks. His heartbeat was steady. He was alive. And outside the delivery room, through the wide hospital windows, the black dog sat watching. Its eyes never wavered. It had done its job. But the real questions had just begun. The delivery room remained silent except for the steady beeping of the monitors and the soft cries of the newborns. Dr. Ethan Grayson stood still, staring down at the baby boy in his hands. His tiny body was covered in an unusual layer of dark, fine hair. The condition was rare but not unheard of. However, there was something unsettling about the way the infant's golden eyes flickered open, as if he were aware of the tension in the room. Rachel returned with the neonatal team, their expressions shifting from professionalism to quiet shock as they took in the sight before them. One doctor, a specialist in genetic disorders, carefully examined the infant. He murmured something about congenital hypertrichosis, a rare but documented condition where infants are born with excessive hair growth due to genetic mutations. But that did not explain the intensity of the moment, nor did it answer the real question forming in Dr. Ethan's mind. Outside the delivery room, the black dog still sat patiently by the window. It had not moved since the birth, its amber eyes locked on the inside of the hospital as if waiting for something. None of the hospital staff approached it. They only whispered to one another, exchanging nervous glances. Meanwhile, Joel Carter, Sienna's husband, burst into the hospital lobby, his gym bag still slung over his shoulder. He was out of breath, his eyes wild with panic. Where is my wife? Where are my babies? A nurse quickly guided him toward the maternity ward, where he nearly collided with Dr. Ethan just outside the delivery room. Dr. Grayson, Joel said, struggling to catch his breath. Is she okay? Are they okay? Dr. Ethan hesitated. He had dealt with high-risk births before, but this was different. He measured his words carefully. Your wife is stable. Both of your children are here, but there is something I need to discuss with you. Joel felt his stomach tighten. His gaze darted past Dr. Ethan and into the room, where he could see Sienna lying on the bed, her body still weak from exhaustion. In the bassinet beside her, two tiny bundles were swaddled in soft white blankets. He stepped forward, his hands trembling as he peered inside. The first baby, a little girl, slept soundly. Her skin was smooth, her chest rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. But when he looked at the second baby, his breath caught in his throat. The boy's face, though delicate and peaceful, was covered in soft, dark hair. His little hands twitched slightly, his golden eyes blinking up at Joel with an eerie sense of awareness. "What is this?" Joel whispered, his voice hoarse. Dr. Ethan spoke calmly. "This is a rare condition called congenital hypertrichosis. It causes excessive hair growth, but medically it is not dangerous." Joel shook his head, his mind racing. But how he turned to Sienna, whose eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. She smiled weakly. "They are beautiful, aren't they?" Joel swallowed hard. "Yes, but—" Then something clicked in his mind. He turned back to Dr. Ethan, his voice barely above a whisper. "Could this be because of me, doctor?" Ethan folded his arms. "That depends. Have you ever used any type of hair growth treatments, specifically medications like minoxidil?" Joel's face drained of color. "Years ago, I used it for a while. I stopped before we started trying for a baby." But Dr. Ethan exhaled slowly. "There have been rare cases where traces of certain medications can influence genetic expression, especially if they affect hormone production. It is not something you could have predicted." Joel's knees nearly buckled. His son's condition was because of him. Sienna reached for his hand. "It does not matter. He is our son. He is perfect." Joel looked at her, his wife, the mother of his children, exhausted yet glowing with love. He let out a shaky breath, nodding as tears welled in his eyes. Outside, the black dog finally stirred. It stood up, shaking out its thick coat, and let out a single low howl before turning and walking away. The security guard watching from the lobby frowned. He had assumed the dog belonged to the family, but now watching it disappear into the early morning mist, he realized something. No one had ever seen the dog enter the hospital, and now it was gone. In the weeks that followed, news of the unusual birth spread. Some called it a medical anomaly. Others whispered that there was something supernatural about the connection between the mother, the child, and the dog that had stood watch over them. But the truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Joel and Sienna took their children home. As the months passed, their baby boy continued to grow, his hair gradually thinning as the doctors had predicted. But one thing never changed. Every night, when the house was quiet, he would lift his tiny head and let out a soft, almost melodic howl, as if calling to something unseen. And somewhere in the distance, a single answering howl always returned. So what do you think? Was this simply a case of rare genetics? Or was there something more to it? Something science cannot fully explain? Let us know your thoughts.